Let me begin by introducing Hans Peter Schipulle. He is the facilitator of the Congo Basin Forest Partnership. Prior to his work, Dr. Schipulle was the Deputy Director General of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. In that position, he headed the department's Global and Sectorial Policies Division. Dr. Schipulle also served as the head of the ministry's Environment and Natural Resource Management and Forestry Division. Carter Roberts, since 2005, has been president and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund, which works in over 100 locations around the globe. WWF is a key Congo Basin Forest Partnership partner. Before heading WWF, Roberts was its Chief Conservation Officer. He also has spent 15 years at the Nature Conservancy. Before his nonprofit career, Mr. Roberts worked in marketing and management, including at Gillette and Procter & Gamble. Dr. Michael Fay. I've long admired the work of Dr. Fay. He undertook the amazing mega transect in which he spent 455 days walking across Africa, and the mega flyover in which he spent months flying 70,000 miles over Africa in a very small plane at a very low altitude, taking a photo every 20 seconds. These amazing efforts were featured in National Geographic and stand as major accomplishments in African conservation. Michael testified to the Africa subcommittee that I chaired prior to this, back in 2003 and I think 2005. And Michael's work protecting California's giant redwood trees is featured in an amazing National Geographic feature in this month's National Geographic. Hans, if you would like to begin, Doctor, go ahead. I'm going to ask you to summarize your testimony, though, in 5 minutes, if you could.
Yeah, I'll try my best. Thanks for the invitation, and it's a great honor for me to be here and to testify on behalf of the CBFP. And while my colleagues here certainly will be speaking more intensively on the state of the Congo Basin forests and the challenges to preserve the ecologic, the economic, and the social function of the Central African ecosystems for this and future generations, I will concentrate my statement on the evolution of the CBFP over the last 8 years, on its relation to the Central African Commission, the COMIFAC, on its accomplishments and its perspective, if you allow. The CBFP, as we heard, was launched in 2002 by the United States with some other partners, and was part of more than 100 initiatives where public and private stakeholders wanted to demonstrate how sustainable development would concretely work in different sectors. For many of them, it was a signal of frustration with all the lengthy negotiations over language for yet another UN resolutions or action programs. They forged coalitions of the willing who wanted to see action now in the spirit of the Rio Agenda 21. It was the merit of the pragmatic approach of the United States, and if I'm not mistaken, on the initiative of the Conservation Caucus.
Hans, there are people in the hall trying to hear also. Pull the mic real close.
And speak louder then.
There you go.
And the initiative was supported by the Conservation Caucus, which led Secretary Paul to take the lead in launching this partnership. Today it constitutes a network of 51 members from governments. The central governments of the region are members of the partnership, 11 other donor countries, 12 international organizations, 13 NGOs and research institutions, and 5 members from the private sector. Update list you will find in the website of the CBFP. At their first meeting in Paris in 2003, CBFP members officially agreed to align their support, to share information, and to better harmonize their activities. The principles of the partnership were set out in a cooperation framework. The overall objective of the partnership has been specified, and now I quote, to enhance the effectiveness of the partners' interventions in favor of the conservation and sustainable management of forest ecosystems, economic growth, and poverty reduction in the countries of Central Africa. And you see this balance between conservation and development aspects, which led the partners to combine, to join efforts in support of what is the strategy, regional strategy in Central Africa. The members decided to operate as a network without a secretarial structure in order to ensure its function of a platform for dialogue and exchange. One member on a rotational basis is asked to serve as a coordinator, or as we call it exactly, a facilitator. At the beginning of the new facilitation phase, members agree on a roadmap with priority areas of action. It is the responsibility of the facilitating member to set up internal and external communication tools and to offer opportunities for exchange. Twice a year, we hold meetings of a regional consultative committee, and every 2 years, plenary meetings. The next one will be in November in Yaoundé. However, the partnership would be an empty shell without the conceptual framework and the operational reference which is being provided by the COMIFAC regional strategy for sustainable forest management and the orientation of this intergovernmental decision-making institution. In their 1999 Yaoundé Declaration, Central African heads of state proclaimed their, and I quote again, commitment to the principle of biodiversity conservation and the sustainable management of the forest ecosystems in Central Africa, as well as their people's rights to be able to count on the forest resources to support their endeavor for economic and social development. The US, in its role as the first CBFP facilitation, encouraged other CBFP members to demonstrate that concerted action in the Congo Basin was feasible without having to create new multilateral organizations likely to jeopardize an independent regional policy process, that the COMIFAC regional strategy may and must be respected as a reference framework for donor activities, and the donor coordination integrating a large number of actors is indeed necessary. The following facilitating members, France 2005 to 2007, and Germany 2008 and 2010, adopted the same careful steering approach in order to ensure continuous regional ownership and to create possibilities for other actors from the international regional community to contribute to specific topics, like the production, as was mentioned right now, of this new important instrument, the Congo Basin, the State of the Congo Basin Forest Report, which the third one has been published right recently for the period till 2008. As you know, CBFP itself is not directly mobilizing or channeling funds. But today, with its accumulated experience in harmonizing regional initiatives, it is able to offer guidance for effective use and governance of additional finance made available by the international community to the Congo Basin. COMIFAC, as strengthened by CBFP's member support, can help to orient and monitor allocation of new funds provided, for example, by the World Bank, by the African Development Bank, or the UK-Norway-sponsored Congo Basin Forest Fund. As the international community develops innovative financing mechanisms, more important funding is likely to be mobilized. The Forest Carbon Partnership Fund, managed by the World Bank, the UN RED program, and allocations of the Global Environment Facility, the GF, are setting the path. However, effective use heavily depends on the concerned country's political ownership and determination to enforce forest protection through appropriate legal frameworks and the establishment of positive incentives for developing new technologies and alternative revenue sources. Now coming to some accomplishments of the Congo Basin Forest Partnership, which highly depends on the single members' initiatives, like the US with their CARPE program. But having been harmonized and aligned due to CBFP's coordination and communication efforts, Their impact on reconciling the integrity of ecosystems with human use and development constitute a clear value added. CBFP attracts also new members and new partners to open up for cooperation. One example is the dialogue with Chinese logging companies, and I come to your earlier questions on these issues, and a Chinese State Forest Administration and other related ministries in China. After having conducted extensive research on Chinese stakeholders' perception in China and consulted other CBFP members with Chinese African programs like the United States State Department and their strategic dialogue, the German facilitation at the last regional consultative committee meeting of the partnership in May 2009 proposed a framework to foster dialogue between China and Central Africa that should combine political agreements and technical cooperation. Now, 2 workshops on the EU flag are under preparation, and COMIFAC has been counseled on how to include the forest chapter into the Forum of Chinese Africa Cooperation, the FOCAC. And we are also discussing, certainly with other partners in the region, like Gabon, and representatives of Gabon are sitting here in the room, to see how we could encourage them. And I think that's certainly their major task, to encourage them to impose their Chinese partners, the new partners, who are not yet on the level of understanding of what sustainable management of forests is all about, to impose their rules and the state of the art on activities of the Chinese. I don't see much possibilities to do that from outside. So I think we should cooperate with the partners in the region to help them to match these problems. CBFP defends balanced regional representation in international negotiations in helping COMIFAC to build up political and technical capacity for the negotiations in UN environment treaties concerning the RED, reducing emissions from deforestation. In the climate context, the access and benefit sharing issue in the Biodiversity Convention, and regional strategies to fight against desertification. And finally, CBFP achieves spillover effects for regional cooperation and security. You mentioned this issue right now. The participatory instruments developed by CBFP members to strengthen the voices of regional civil society and parliamentarian networks in the forest management issues, mostly through the CEFTAC, a subsidiary of the COMIFAC, have contributed to a democratic learning process in a conflict-ridden region. You ask, Mr. Chairman, for future perspective and recommendations for improved effectiveness of the CBFP. Let me mention just 4 points. CBFP will continue to play its role as a mediator, capable of engaging in constructive discussion with a large number of actors. It will embrace critical stakeholders whose overambitious campaigns threaten to stop positive reform processes in the region, such as the dialogue on the review of forest concessions titles in DRC in March 2009, and will persist in its outreaching activities to generate consensus on the best approaches to promote sustainable forest use and protection in the Congo Basin. Second, CBFP will emphasize regional institutional stability and capacity as the key for sustaining the impacts of its combined efforts. COMIFAC has received a unique mandate and needs to stay operational. This means well-funded and politically supported by its member states, not from outside only, in order to be able to serve as a model institution for other regions. Third, CBFP recommends capitalizing on its experiences acquired with the unique institutional setup, strengthening and improving effectiveness of a regional organization through the support of an international partnership. In its capacity to promote good governance and cooperation, the Congo Basin institutional acquis could develop into a blueprint that is likely to facilitate implementation of new mechanisms, such as the RED under the Climate Convention. And fourth, large international NGOs that work with local affiliated partner structures and the regional networks operating through CEFDAC are vital for enriching CBFP's internal dialogue. CBFP members will undertake further efforts to enhance the participation and visibility of local partners inside and outside the partnership. The German facilitation of CBFP recommends partners, including the United States, to continue with an integrative approach of combining support to COMIFAC institutional setup, preferably through the Yaoundé-based support office, with the strengthening of national structures, allowing a productive networking throughout the region. This would also allow a new facilitation team to acquire sufficient information and knowledge to perform its function. As previous teams, it stands ready to transfer experience to the new facilitation, which should be designated by CBFP members during the next plenary meeting on November 11 and 12 in Yaoundé. I hope, Mr. Chairman, that I was able to provide sufficient evidence, not only for the U.S. leadership in support of the Congo Basin in managing their forest ecosystems, but also for the rationale to continue this engagement even more intensively in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Oli, we'll now go to Colonel.
Thank you for the honor of being here to talk about one of my favorite programs. In our work, there are 3 great forests of the world, tropical forests of the world, and they're in different states of disrepair. Borneo, there's only 30% left. The Amazon, there's 80% left. The Congo is the best by far with 85% left. And this project that we're talking about, this program, is what I consider to be the signature project of U.S. foreign assistance as it relates to the environment. It's really without peer. It's the only one that comes close is the Coral Triangle Initiative, which just got started last year. And why I think it's the signature project is it establishes the central role of natural resources for security, for governance, for livelihoods, and for biodiversity conservation in the heart of an incredibly important continent. It has knit together nations across borders. It's knit together the funding community across nations. It's knit together NGOs. It's one of the best examples where the NGO community has actually worked together as part of a partnership with the governments in these nations. So if you want, you asked about a vision for foreign assistance and the relevance of this program. And there's no question at this particular moment, as the White House has started a foreign assistance review, and the State Department has started QDDR, and Congress has started a process of its own, that this stands as a model of what foreign assistance ought to look like, where sustainable development is seen as just as important as defense and diplomacy and development per se. So we need, in our foreign assistance strategy, a vision that makes this one of its fundamental pillars. And we also need a USAID administrator who gets this vision and can carry it out. And we need a development agency that has the capacity to do more of the same. In fact, I'd argue a lot more capacity to do more of the same. All this is occurring in the context of climate change, and we all know that surely we will fail to solve climate change if we don't save forests. And the converse is we will fail to save the forests if we don't incorporate them into a climate change agreement, both to put a price on carbon, but also to begin to capture all the important services that the Congo performs, water towers, livelihoods, even climate creation of its own. The cornerstone of this are parks. And CBFP, along with the commitment of these nations, has been a parks machine. It's created 22 protected areas, 11.5 million acres. It has put 11.5 million acres under FSC management. There are 130 areas that are managed in one form or another through this program, And there are 12 landscapes that cover a third of the Congo, all part of this program and all part of this regional initiative. As we are thinking ahead to Copenhagen, thinking ahead to how we deal with climate change, this program is at a critical stage in its life. And if the parks are the cornerstone, then national capacity are the timbers of this program, and this is the moment to make sure that we shore those up. And so we have a great legacy through this program, but I'd urge you and the State Department and the White House to make sure that at this moment we don't lose those gains, that we shore up the cornerstones, we strengthen the timbers, and we make sure that this stands not only as a model for how we might address climate change, but also a model for what foreign assistance should look like in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Carter. We'll now go to Dr. Michael Fay.
Thank you, Congressman, for having me here today. I'm always really happy to be invited to the Hill to give testimony because it gives me the opportunity to feel what it's like to wear shoes again. So it's a good thing. September 5th, 2002 was an amazing day. It was a post-9/11 world. The United States was preparing to invade Iraq. International tension was high. Helicopters hovered above. Hundreds of soldiers with M16s surrounded the perimeter. Secretary of State Colin Powell jumped out into a whirl of sand on the beach and entered the forest. As I accompanied the Secretary deeper into the woods, his eyes wide open, he said, "This is the first time I've been in the jungle since Vietnam." He had come to Gabon not to curry votes at the United Nations, but to meet with President Bongo to visit one of the 13 national parks that he had just created to discuss the Congo Basin Forest Partnership. It was a photo op. He was to spend 5 minutes hiking in the forest. Ignoring the beckoning of his fixers, we walked slowly for almost an hour. Secretary Powell was captivated by the sounds, the size of the trees, the height of the canopy, and the turquoise Atlantic surf. And he kept looking over his shoulder every time we saw another pile of elephant dung. Mr. Powell understood what Teddy Roosevelt said so many times. The conservation of natural resources is the fundamental problem. Unless we solve that problem, it will avail us little to solve all others. So, it's very logical, you know, every person on Earth eats, drinks, and uses resources from the planet every day. That's how we get our sustenance. So, human consumption has to be balanced with the capacity to produce. Very simple. Well, this CBFP and USAID's intervention under CARPE would be a very different kind of thing. It's exactly what Carter was talking about. You know, this was not a development project that we're talking about. This was a conservation project, recognizing that there are limits and that the conservation of the natural resource base for humanity is essential. It's essential. We can't get around it. We can do whatever we want, but we will never get away from that truth. So this was a simple concept. In each landscape, and there were many, there would be protected areas. These would preserve the lion's share of the species, be permanent source areas for water and other ecological services, training grounds for a large number of resource managers, provide destinations for tourists, and perhaps most importantly serve as flagships for establishing a strong natural resource management ethic in the Congo Basin. At the same time, CBFP would help national governments, local people, industrial, national resource extractors, and development projects to assure that while human development proceeded, the natural resource base, the fundamental, was not depleted in the meantime. That for me is the objective of this project, not to mix development with kind of this sustainable development. It's to look out for the natural resource base and to assure that as development occurs, the natural resource base will be available to the next and the next and the next generation. Because if it isn't, all of this development is useless. It is for naught. Since CBFP started in 2002, there's been a huge amount of progress. There's been, you know, a consistent increase in the number of protected areas and the contribution of national governments to their management. Logging companies have significantly altered their practices, and national governments have gained significant capacity to assure sustainable management. And conservation is now being integrated into government policy and action like never before. COMIFAC is strong and active, and you've heard today from a number of people about that. So today, sitting in this round table, you know, there were a lot of Africans from Central Africa who understand this concept perfectly. And we've been talking about it for decades now, and many of the people in the room I've known for decades, including Minister Jumbo here. So you know, what do I see as our biggest problem? Our biggest problem is that we have identified over a long period of time a lot of the nuts and bolts things that we need to accomplish on the ground. And the list is long. We all met in Kinshasa in 2003 and came up with this matrix of what, you know, the starting point of what we need to accomplish here. And we're talking about, you know, a lot of hard work in small villages throughout the Congo Basin. We're not talking about just having meetings, you know. We're talking about nuts and bolts things that need to happen every day, all day, for decades in order for the Congo Basin to reach this goal. And the CBFP was put in place to do that. So to cut right to the chase, I think that you know, we have to make sure that that's where our focus is. We don't want to spend the mother load on concepts. We want to spend the mother load on action. And now that we have these action plans, let's enact them. One other thing I wanted to say. I agree completely with Carter. This is something, and Colin Powell understood this perfectly. This is about all the things that concern us as far as human security go, food security, sustainable development, all these things. If you don't have the natural capital, and we talk about, you know, instability in Central Africa, well, you know, if you look at a lot of the problems that are being faced in Chad and Sudan and even Eastern DRC, a lot of them have a very strong resource base kind of root to them. And if that root problem had been addressed decades before, because the development world has never recognized the natural resource base as core to human prosperity, then we might not have those conflicts today. So I think that if we really wanted to get experimental to prove that this is a very workable model, and I think it's absolutely necessary, and I think there should be 100 CBFPs around the world, and I think they should be working with 100 times more money because they are much more effective bang for the buck. One that would concentrate on the Sudano-Sahelian area just north of the Congo Basin that is rife with conflict, human suffering, humanitarian crises, etc. I guarantee you, if there was a CBFP in the area of southern Sudan, northeastern DRC, Chad, Mali, and Niger, in 20 years, it would be a very different place, and things would be closer to sustainable than they will be looking forward. And there was a gentleman today in the forum that said, you know, I'm from eastern Chad, and I've seen the change in my lifetime. In 50 years, I have seen things go very far south. And resource management is at the core. That's him saying that. And he...
And you've been on the ground, and like you say, you've sat through an infinite number of meetings where we've all agreed on what needs to be done. But at the end of the day, as you say, the resources are not getting down, for example, to the park rangers. You know, if they don't have the speedboats to catch the poachers, or if they don't have the other equipment necessary, you know, just on the front lines, we're not doing what we need to do. So let's just discuss that for a minute. What could be done to make certain that those resources go to protect parkland? And then I want to go to John's questions here.
Well, I think all you have to do is look at, you know, after working in, you know, many places, people say to me, follow the money, you know, and then you'll know. Well, you know, and I'm not criticizing here. I absolutely am not criticizing what's happening on the ground. I think we've made a huge amount of progress, and I think that the Central African countries are unbelievably committed to forest conservation and natural resource conservation in general. But when you're working in park after park after park in Central Africa, and you see these places languishing, and you see local people kind of scratching their heads thinking, you know, we hear all this stuff, and they have meetings too. You know, every single banjo in Congo has probably had 25 meetings about sustainable development and all these great things that are going to happen for their village as it comes down the line. Well, you know, every village chief says the same thing. He's like, yeah, but when's it going to happen? You know, we need this to happen. So I think that, you know, you have to just look at, okay, what are we actually really contributing on the ground to national parks, to forest concession management, to working with local communities to find the checks and balances between resource use. And I think you'll find that, you know, the amount of money that is being spent, both by national governments and by the international community, pales in comparison to the task. And it gets back to what Carter said, you know, it's like, because we've never identified this as an important national, international kind of objective. And so we've never, I mean, biodiversity still only gets 1% of foreign assistance, and it needs to be more than that. And it boils down to very simple things. You know, if you don't have the cash for an outboard motor, you don't get one. If you don't have the cash for a Toyota Land Cruiser, you don't get one. If you don't have the ability to create schools that integrate conservation kind of curricula into those schools, it's not going to exist. All this stuff takes resources, so it just takes more, and it takes a better kind of balance between talking and doing.
Yeah. John Tanner was the first in Congress to lead a trip to Gabon and come back and tell us what would befall that environment without our intervention. And John, I want to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank all three of you for a most interesting dialogue and presentation. And I, too, remember when Michael got gored by that elephant. We were worried about him. I want to start by asking about the Central Africa Forest Commission and what role it could play in some of the observations that Ed made to the Secretary with respect to China and with respect to people who are doing things that are in violation of what we all have agreed to heretofore. I'd like your comment if...
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. Well, the first thing is that there is a need to have a direct contact. 2 years ago, there was not such a relationship between the regional structure, which is the Commission, the COMIFAC, the Secretariat, Presidency, and so forth, and the Chinese actors as far as they are based in China. So first thing, what we try to do now is to establish a sort of regular contact, and it's quite difficult. For example, the China-Africa dialogue, which is under the African Union leadership, doesn't embrace the forest issues. The Chinese people I spoke to in Beijing, they told me we would like to engage in including the forest issue in our cooperation on that level with China. We never were asked by the African countries to do that. So the first thing we said, well, we have to encourage COMIFAC to go through the African Union, because the Chinese will not follow our advice as a CBFP. This is something which has to come from Africa to bring that on the table of the dialogue. And the Chinese are prepared to engage even in support program, training programs for the staff of the African institutions. And they're very keen, because they know that they are under critics, that there's a reputational risk, if you want, if they don't do something on that front. We are very optimistic that if we use all of us, those who are in dialogue, like the strategic dialogue between the US and China, and the dialogue of the European Union on forest law enforcement and governance, the so-called FLAG, to bring these initiatives together, to encourage the Chinese to engage in let's say, promoting their good strategies, which they just have formulated in their guidelines for foreign Chinese companies in forest management. They just issued that a couple of months ago. But they as well are not able to enforce to the private sector Chinese people. So they need our support, and they need, it's our advice, to join the partnership and to join us in our dialogue we are organizing all the time in the region. For example, there was very recently a major in April, major conference on the role of the private sector, the industrial logging companies in forest management, which try to include the Chinese operators. Sometimes they are already amongst those who make progress. They have FSC certification programs already, but some others are sitting aside and just looking what happens here.
Just, I'd love to comment on the China question. I'm really glad you raised it. We produce a report every 2 years called the Living Planet Report. Right now it estimates humanity demands 1.25 times what the Earth can sustain. And we estimate that if the average Chinese adopts the same standard of living we have here in the United States, we'll need 2 more planets. And so, as goes China's consumption, so goes so many things that we care about in the world, unless we're able to engage the Chinese on the supply chains, the impacts of development, the impacts of sourcing. It is the Africa-China conversation is fundamental. And what we've observed is there is an openness in the Chinese government to that conversation, but they need to hear strong voices from the nations in Africa that that's what they want. And that's there's a real opening there, and I think a critical element are the signals that the nations in Africa themselves send to the government about what they need, and particularly around this partnership.
That's kind of what I picked up reading through this material. I'm glad you did it, Michael.
Well, gets back to, I guess, my testimony, but a couple of years ago when that controversy was brewing about the Chinese in Luongo National Park. And this is an example of, you know, kind of, okay, the big picture. We all understand the big picture? Oh, sorry. It is on. Okay, sorry. But there's a need to do things on the ground. And so, lo and behold, myself and others with the Gabonese government visited the Chinese exploration camp in Luongo. No one had done that. We sat down with all the guys operating on the ground, and this was almost impromptu, okay? We weren't invited into their camp. Sat down with all the guys running the operation, explained the concerns, brought in the local kind of regional tribal and administrative chief to talk to the Chinese, and for the entire period that those Chinese were in the park, granted in the park, but that was, we're kind of working after the fact now, but during that entire time that they were in the park, what was amazing to all of us was how if we made a recommendation to the Chinese and explained what needed to be done, they did it. No questions asked. They did it and they followed it to a T. And so it's like that's what I'm talking about. If there were people working with Chinese logging companies and oil companies and iron companies on the ground throughout the basin, we'd see vast change in the attitude and the actions of Chinese very quickly. And that's what we should be doing. We should be doing it everywhere with everyone.
How do we do that? How do we get started? Yes, sir.
In May 2008, we organized in Gabon a workshop with Asian operators, mainly Chinese operators, to promote the intra-professional dialogue amongst those newcomers from China. And as Michael said, they are very interested to hear what's all that certification, forest law enforcement, management plans. They came from China with not much understanding of the state of the forest management, which is now already state of the art in many of the companies, as was already said right now. So I think a regular interprofessional dialogue and flagging the leaders amongst the Chinese companies. There's one in Gabon. I visited in Lambaréné in February, the Sonri Sunli. They are engaged in forest management, but also in FSC certification. They invest in these certification programs, and we have to showcase that. And that's our effort in the partnership through dialogue programs. In a recent meeting in Douala, we repeated this. We had again the Chinese operators, those who want to be there. I think this is a very important role of the partnership to promote this dialogue and to encourage also the governments to impose their rules and regulations on these operators, not only in the forest sector, it's in the mining and in agriculture, which are a bit away from what we are doing in the CBFP, unfortunately.
Well, I would say, that's the genius, really, of CBFP and kind of this landscape concept. And it's certainly something that I've seen in southeastern Chad in the last few years. If there is a conservation presence, and we've got these kind of flagship national parks that are protected areas and managed as such, and then we have a constellation of managed forestry concessions and interactions with that conservation infrastructure with all resource users, including local people, then I think that lo and behold, you'd see that just about everyone in that landscape would start to join in, participate in this process, and they'd be doing real things. Again, it's like when you look at the initiative that we started with Minister Jumbo in the CIB concession back in, I don't even remember what year that was. It was like in the 90s. That was a revolutionary concept. They used to pay the pygmy workers there with 458 shells and shotgun shells to hunt for their sustenance, and there would be hundreds of people in these concessions as they go out and mark trees and cut trees, hunting, you know, and it was just the status quo. That is no longer the status quo. And the reason that has happened is because people are working on the ground with logging operators to teach them how wildlife management is done, you know, and it's a long, hard process. It's not just talking about it. It takes hard work. It takes years and years and years of work. That project in the CIB concession in northern Congo is still ongoing, and it's not complete yet. So, but it has transformed the way logging has occurred throughout Central Africa. It's spreading, you know, and every concession's there now. But CIB was virtually the first company to do that, and it happened organically on the ground.
I think the moment is ripe for what we're talking about. And speaking on behalf of WWF, we have staff in Beijing working with Chinese companies on how they source materials. That's true of other large conservation NGOs as well. Having the next round of the Congo Basin Partnership build that capacity on the ground, the people who really understand the commodities, understand the markets, can engage China, both within the governments and in the landscapes, I think would be invaluable. So the next time you wander into the camp, around the campfire, you have somebody who really knows the timber trade and can talk turkey. And I think there's an enormous openness. I just came back from the Amazon, where there is in place right now a moratorium in the Amazon on soy or beef that is sourced on any land in which a tree has been cut down since 2005. And so the biggest slaughterhouses in the world, and Carrefour and Cargill and all those companies now will only buy soy or beef from land in which a tree has not been cut. And so there's this enormous moment in the market in which I think governments see this opportunity and the private sector sees the opportunity. Certainly we do. And I think having the capacity in the landscapes and in the consumer countries to manage that would be extremely powerful.
That's a pretty optimistic note. I'm glad to hear it. I think our challenge is getting people to understand that we have to reconcile human existence with the capacity of this planet to sustain us. And at the end of the day, anything we can do and any tool we can use, and if the market will help us by doing that, I'm going to write them a letter and thank them for refusing to buy on cleared land. I really am pleased. I turn it back to you, Ed, but thank all of you very, very much.
Thank you, John. I concur. We should try to work with China, and I'm glad to hear these positive stories. But at the end of the day, the story in the New York Times about the fact that the Chinese company provided little food for its workers, and therefore they were involved in killing the bushmeat, is one that came from park officials. All right. At the end of the day, this engagement with China, what you're doing is tremendously important, and I can see that on some fronts you're making progress. I hope that just as the French engineers who came back in the 1960s from Gabon and said, look, we can build this down where the rapids are, not up where the falls are. It'll be a far less cost. We can produce just as much energy, and it won't have the environmental degradation. Let's hope that the Chinese are as open to that logic as that engineering for. Yes, Michael, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add kind of a, you know, parenthetical kind of story to that one. Back in the 60s, Shell Oil Company moved into Gabon in a very big way. And they discovered large amounts of oil in protected areas almost exclusively in protected areas. They went in, and this is Shell, this is not the Chinese, and they built a oil infrastructure in that area, which was protected, that took absolutely no account of the existence of a reserve or the infrastructure that they were putting in there with relationship to the natural resource base, local people, local sustenance, etc. When that dam proposal came down the pipeline in Gabon, and I think this is one of the things that is an obvious benefit of CBFP and this participation by Central African countries. There was a very large brouhaha in Gabon. It was in the local papers. Madame Coco, I don't know if she's in the room, to put it bluntly, butted heads with a lot of people as the Minister of the Environment to get this right and to address a serious kind of problem that she, as the Minister of Environment, was responsible for. That didn't used to happen. That did not used to happen. It does now, almost systematically. So I think we've made huge progress, but we have a long way to go.
I think we have made huge progress, and I followed your discussions with respect to what we've done to stop the clear cutting of logging, of timbering there. But I was up on the border between Zimbabwe and Zambia and watching what was being done with resource exploitation in Zimbabwe on China's part, and watching the political corruption there. And so I know that this engagement, and I've seen the effect of civil society, which is one of the things you're talking about. Because when the armament ship came in to the port in South Africa with the armaments that Mugabe wanted in order to use against his people, it was turned back by the trade union there, or by the ship workers. Then it went to Southwest Africa, and at the port it was turned back by civil society leaders that said, no, you're not going to unload those weapons to send them into Zimbabwe. Then it went to Angola, and again the ship was turned back. By then, African civil society groups were calling it the ship of shame, and it went back to China without unloading its weapons. So I see the impact that a stronger civil society is having in Africa, and I see the partnership that we're bringing to this dialogue in terms of the international community. Hans beginning to dialogue with the Chinese about these practices. So I see the progress being made there. I just know it's going to be kind of a steep climb based on what I saw in Zimbabwe. So let me just ask if there are any other points. Hans, did you want to make another point?
A quick point that you're absolutely right. That's the fantastic thing with the partnership, that we have both sides, the NGOs with their engagement, but also members, the governments as members of the CBFP. But I would like to flag that we have to be careful that we shouldn't substitute the local structures. I mean, it's a cumbersome thing. We need lots of problems in the administrations, but at the end of the day, we need these administrations. So we need to go the way to strengthen them, to help them, to bring it in order. I mean, we have great programs now in restructuring the forest services in the countries like Cameroon, like DRC, and I think that's a very important thing, because we can't be there all the time. They are responsible for their countries, and they need to be trained and supported in doing the job, whether it's a dialogue with the Chinese, whether that's the park management at the end, and the control of the private sector activities. So I want to appeal to that and to say that no substitution. It would be, let's say, a dead end of our activities. That's our experience also in our development cooperation programs.
Carter?
I had two closing comments. One is, as we talk about our foreign assistance strategy, there's of course there's the obvious mechanism of USAID to support programs like this, but I would be remiss in also not pointing out the critical role of the Global Environmental Facility, which right now is entering a new phase of replenishment and has played a major role here and also in bringing in the involvement of other countries. And just to underscore the comment that Hans-Peter just made, at the end of the day, it's about the governments in these countries asking for the right things for the Chinese and supporting these efforts. And I must say, sitting in the room today with the Prime Minister of Comifec, two presidents, and all the ministers of environment there, speaking with great conviction about the importance of this program was inspiring to me, and really quite something, and speaks volumes to the importance of this program to their countries and how they see their future.
Thank you, Carter.
Yeah, I would just close by saying that the closing remark of President Sassou today was, "Nous n'avons pas le droit à l'erreur," which means basically, you know, we don't have room for error here. We have to get it right, and if we don't, we could lose the whole thing, you know, and we've seen that happen in Asia. So we need to get it right, and we need to act quickly, and we need to act massively. And so I think that we should just listen to what everyone has said today and buckle down and get all that hard work done on the ground.
Well, thanks, Mike. And lastly, I think we want to recognize all of our African visitors in the audience. We have a number of African NGOs. The African Diplomatic Corps, we want to recognize you, and African ministers that are here. Thank you all, and thank you for attending this hearing. We're adjourned.